Welcome to the fourth tutorial of my Tableau Server Client series. This series is dedicated to showcasing how to use Tableau Server Client to automate various tasks. In this video, I will walk you through the process of generating a report containing important details on each of the users of your Tableau server. I'll show you how to query your Tableau server for each user's information using Tableau Server Client and subsequently write that information to an Excel workbook. Before jumping into the coding aspect of this video, allow me to speak to this type of report's use cases. A user's report allows you to understand what your Tableau server looks like in terms of users. It allows you to answer questions like, how many total users does our Tableau server currently support? How many creators, explorers, and viewers do we have? Does the user have the correct license type? When did the user last sign into our server? Does the user still need a license? Tableau licenses are not cheap, so being able to quickly determine which users are logging in frequently versus those who are rarely logging in or not at all may help your organization reduce costs associated with licensing. Additionally, a user's report allows you to understand the amounts and types of content each user owns. Is the user a content owner? Understanding which users own content will be useful when your organization decides to upgrade their Tableau Prep, desktop, and server versions. You can work with those content owners to ensure proper testing is done to avoid unforeseen and undocumented issues with the new version. How many flows, data sources, and workbooks are associated with each user and which ones? Being able to link server objects like flows, workbooks, and data sources to individuals is very important. For example, suppose you want to perform a review of all content stored on your server to ensure only content actively being used is stored on the server and all others removed. A report consisting of a list of users and the corresponding content tied to each allows you to do that. Having briefly discussed the use cases, I will now jump over to Visual Studio Code to begin writing a script to generate a report on my Tableau server users. For this example, I'm going to send a request to my Tableau server to provide a list of all users existing on the server. After retrieving that list of user objects, I will create a simple report that provides important details on each user. As a bonus, I will walk you through how to add a column to the report indicating whether the user owns flows, workbooks, and data sources. At the end of this walkthrough, I will show you how to write the user's report to an Excel file for reporting and dissemination purposes. For the first step, I need to configure my connection to the Tableau server. If you are unfamiliar with how to configure a connection to your Tableau server for authentication purposes, please watch video 2 of this series. In that video, I walk through connecting to Tableau server for the first time. I will also place the link to the video in the comments section. In this next step, I need to use the Tableau Server Client object I configured above to sign in. I'm using a context manager to ensure I stay signed in while attempting to access information on my Tableau server. Additionally, this ensures that I also sign out each time. To begin generating a user's report, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run this first block of code that's going to allow me to create a Tableau Server Client object. We're going to use that object to sign into my server. Okay, so the object's created. Let's now sign into the server. So what I'm doing here again, I'm using Context Manager to sign in and to ensure that as soon as all of the code that's encapsulated or captured with this Context Manager below it, as soon as that's executed, it signs me out automatically. Let's go ahead and run this. And the reason I'm running this before writing any additional code is I want to explore the user's endpoint. So how am I going to get the information related to each user on my server? What I'm going to do is I'm going to need to extract attributes from each user object using the user's endpoint or resource. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So I'm going to go to, what I'll do is I'll do help, let's do server._dict, and let's look at the endpoints for my server object. So in this we have a variety of endpoints, groups, jobs, all things that you're probably familiar with. Additionally, we have workbooks, data sources, favorites, flows, and we have users. So this is the endpoint we actually want to use to extract the user objects from our server and get the important information related to each. So let's do this. What we're going to do is to extract each user. I'm going to put each of these users in a list. So I'm going to say users equal, I'm going to say user for user in tsc.pager server.users. So again, here, this is the endpoint that we're going to use to extract or generate a list of user objects, and we're going to capture those within a list. So here's a list comprehension. We're saying for each user on my server, append that or populate this list with each user. So let's go ahead and run this. Okay, and then let's look at what does our users object look like, right? So what does our list of users look like? All right, so we have 2 users. We have a list of length 2, so I can just show that here. So we have length 2, and our users contains 2 user objects. So what you're looking at here is 2 user objects, and we have the LUID, or locally unique identifier. This is super important if you're trying to link users to other objects such as workbooks, flows, data sources. So who owns it? The name, which is my email address, and the role, site administrator, creator, authentication setting, domain, so forth. And we see that for each user. So there's 2 unique users on my server. Both of them are actually tied to me, just different email accounts. But how are we going to make use of this information? So these are objects here, 2 objects, 2 user objects. And what we can do is we can explore, okay, what attributes does each user object contain? And these are going to be a fixed set of attributes per object. So let's go ahead and do users dot underscore dict to see what we can extract from each of these objects. And I need to actually refer to the first user object in this list. All right, so for the first user object in my users list of user objects, that's a tongue twister. Okay, we have an attribute authentication setting, domain name, external user ID, last login, workbooks, favorites, groups, email, full name, and site role. So what I want to do here in my user report that I want to create is I want to extract the important information such as the user ID. So that's the LUID, the locally unique identifier, the username, the display name, which is going to be, if you're familiar with the Tableau Server front end, there's actually a display name and a name, the user email address, the user domain. I don't think the domain here in this case is going to be useful. You can't see that attribute here shown in this dictionary. So there's not a key here in this dictionary for this object that says domain, but it does exist, but you have to query that separately per user. And I'll walk through that here in a moment. I don't think on my Tableau cloud server, it's going to provide any useful information, but we'll go ahead and query it anyways. If you're using a Tableau on-premise server, I know for a fact that the domain could be very useful. So if you have users that are spread across the globe, so you have one domain per region, say Brazil, North America, UK and I, or in EMEA, things like that, that could be useful because you're going to be able to say, okay, I have these users and they're located within this region based on the domain. All right, let's move forward. So let's create this report. So how are we going to create this report? We're just going to use a pandas data frame. So I'm going to say user info equals, and then I'm going to say pd.dataframe. And I'm going to open these parentheses and then begin to create a list of key value pairs, right? So I want the user ID, name, display name, email address, domain, and site role. So what I can do is I'm going to provide those column namings as the keys. So I'm going to say user ID. And then I'm going to use list comprehension to gather the user ID for each user. So I'm going to say user.id, so the ID attribute, for user in our list of users. Now, this may seem over the top for a list of 2 users, but when you have hundreds or thousands of users, this is going to perform really well. So I've personally done this for 1,600 plus users. This report that we're building here, you're going to be able to run this in seconds. Let's continue. A lot of this is going to be copy and paste too, because really what we're doing is we're just the variation here from column to column or attribute to attribute is simply going to be the name we provide and the attribute we're extracting from the user object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just copy and paste this and make those changes. So we need the user ID. We want the username. We want the display name. So I'm going to say user display name. We also want the email address. And for your report, perhaps you don't want all these attributes, but for the purpose of this example, I'm going to include them. Let's do domain and user site role. So the domain, again, is going to be a little bit different because this attribute isn't naturally stored within each user object. You actually have to query and pull out the domain separately. So what I'm going to need to do is for each user, I need to query each individual user object. So I'm going to say server.users.get by ID. And then I'm going to pass in the user ID. And then I'm going to say .domain because I need to access that attribute. Domain name for user and users. So I'm going to take off this extra piece here. Let me just verify that I typed this out right. So server.users.get by ID. Again, we're pulling each user domain or the domain name for each user separately. So one by one for each user in the list of users. So unfortunately, you have to make this call separately. It doesn't naturally come across with each user object. And that's why that's why these list comprehensions look different from all the others. So this one looks different from the rest of them, right? Okay. And just to reiterate for this example, I don't think we're going to get any useful information out of this domain name from my Tableau cloud server, but on-premise, you will definitely get good information. Okay, so we have our data frame. We're going to extract for each user the user ID, the name, display name, email address, domain, and site role. Let's go ahead and run this. Make sure there's no errors. There is, so I'm not signed in apparently. Let's go ahead and see, missing site ID, must sign in first. Let me verify. Let's run this again. Oh. All right, so the mistake I made is because I actually haven't retrieved this piece yet, so this isn't naturally part of the user object and I'm making a separate call. I actually need to include this in here while I'm connected, right? Because at the end of this, so at the end of this block, my context manager signed me out and I can't grab any additional information or make an additional call to get the user domain or the domain name for each user if I'm not actually signed in. So let's go ahead and run this, and I'm just going to keep it all in this block for this example. So let me just comment this too. So let's just say create a data frame containing user information. Run this, and then let's look at it. So let's look at our user info data frame. All right, so for the two users on my server, I have the user ID. So this is the locally unique identifier. This is super important if you want to tie each user to, say, workbooks, data sources, flows, or any other objects on the server. So their subscriptions, their favorites, super critical that you understand what that is. Username, and with the username, I've made a mistake here, right? So we don't want the ID, we want the actual name. And we want, for the display name, we want full name. And for the email address, we want email. So what I failed to do is I failed to update the actual attribute that we're extracting. And that was kind of the downside to my copy and paste. Completely forgot to update those attributes. So let's go ahead and run this. And now we see that for each user, we have their ID, the username, the display name, email address, the domain. Not very useful, so it's just saying it's Tableau ID with multi-factor authentication. My site role, which is critical, so I'm a site administrator creator with one account and a viewer with the other. All right, so we have our basic report, but as a bonus here, and I've mentioned this previously, what I want to walk through is how can I take each of these users and determine whether or not each of these users own content or not. What I can do, this is a sneak peek into future tutorials. I can access, let's go ahead and do a similar strategy for accessing user objects, but for flows and data sources and workbooks. So let me just notate this really quick. So gather user ID values for owners of flows, data sources, and workbooks. So the idea here is we're going to write 3 lines of code that are going to largely look like this, except we're going to be accessing flow objects, data source objects, and workbook objects. And the key reason we're going to do this is because we want to grab the LUID, or the unique identifier that's associated with each of these objects of the owner. And if we grab those owner IDs for each of the flows, data sources, and workbooks, we can tie those back to the actual user object, right? So who owns that? So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to say flow owners equals, And this is going to look, we're going to use the same exact type of structure. We're going to use a list comprehension. I'm just going to say flow for flow in TSC server dot flows. All right, so the endpoint or resource in this case is going to be server.flows. And I didn't mention this at the beginning of this tutorial, but pager, so the use of tsc.pager is going to allow us to paginate through your entire set of flows on your server. So if you have, say, over 100 flows, which I think is the default page limit or the number of items you can have on each page when you're querying, you may, if you don't use this method, you may run into an instance where you realize that you've run this report and you only see 100 items. And you're like, where's the rest of it? Well, that's because it stopped on page 1. If you use tsc.pager, it's going to naturally and do this heavy lifting for you and ensure that you capture all of your flows or whichever type of object that you're querying for. So that's the benefit of that. So let's do data source owners. And I'll just type this out, data source for data source in tsc.pager server.data sources. Okay, so again, same idea. We're going to use list comprehension to capture or to create a list that contains the data sources or the data source objects on my Tableau server. So data source for data source in tsc.pager, and then refer to the data source endpoint. All right, so finally, let's do workbooks. Workbook owners equals, and do workbook for workbook. And the workbooks endpoint or resource. All right, so we have that. Let's go ahead and run this code again. So this is going to not only regenerate my user info data frame, but it's also going to generate 3 lists. So one list that contains the user IDs associated with each flow, or the owner IDs associated with each data source, and the owner IDs associated with each workbook. So let's run this. And then what we'll do is we'll just explore each of those lists. So flow owners. All right, so we have the 2 flow objects. And what we're going to want to extract from this is we're going to want to extract the actual ID value, right? Because we want to know what the ID value is for each of these flows. So what we're going to do back here, so we don't want the actual entire object, right? So we don't need this additional information. We just want the actual owner ID. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do flow.owner ID here. I'm going to say data source dot owner ID, and I'm going to say workbook dot owner ID. So what this is going to do is instead of creating a list of flow objects, data source objects, and workbook objects, it's going to create a list of just the owner IDs associated with each of those flows. Because that's all we need, right? We do not need the entire object and its attributes. We want just the owner IDs, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to tie back each of these objects back to a particular user. So I run this. And then when I rerun this flow owners, we're going to see just the ID values. Okay. And then let's look at data source owners. Okay, so we have 6 data sources and workbook owners. So the number of IDs in here is going to indicate how many workbooks, data sources, and flows we have on the server, or I have. All right, so we have 4 workbooks. Okay, so we have our list of IDs for each object type that we want to tie back to users. Now, what can we do to get these unique values, right? So we don't want actually 4 of these, right? If these are all the same, we want the unique values. We want to create a master list of owner IDs, right? Because we're not trying to determine who owns flows, who owns data sources, or who owns workbooks. We're just trying to make a high-level determination on who owns content. And content is, do I own flows? Do I own data sources? Do I own workbooks? Any combination of those. So what we want to do here is, let's go ahead and use sets to get the unique list of user IDs, or owner IDs in this case, for each object type. So flows, data sources, and workbooks. So I'm going to say flow owners equals set flow owners, and do the same thing for data source And the same thing for workbooks. Okay, so this is going to take each of those original lists that we created using list comprehension and up here and create a unique set, right? So we're gonna have just the unique values that were in each of those lists. So if I run this and then I explore, let's just do one of these, right? So let's just do flow owners. See, only one now, right? And this is a set. Now, again, going back to what I just mentioned a few minutes ago, the idea here is just to determine if a user owns content. We don't care what type, but do they own flows, data sources, or workbooks? What I want to do here is I want to take each of these sets, so these unique listings of user IDs across these three sets, and can make a combined set. What this doesn't allow me to do is to determine, again, not what type of content a person owns, but do they own any of the three content? And it's going to be a unique listing or set of user IDs. So let's go ahead and say flow owners. It doesn't really matter which set I start with in this case. What I want to do is just make a merge set, so a combined set that contains that unique list of user IDs. And I use list loosely here because it's not going to be a list, it's going to be a set. Say update, and then I'm going to say data source owners. So it's going to allow me to merge these two sets. So flow owners is now actually going to contain the original unique list of owner IDs along with the unique data source owner IDs. And then, so if I run this, that's going to merge those two. And now I want to take that merged list or merged set and also merge in the workbook owners. So I'm going to say data source or flow owners dot update. I'm going to say workbook owners. And then what I want to do here is I want to create one final merge set that's with a more intuitive name. Say owners equals set and then flow owners. So basically I'm taking the state of the flow owner set at this point in time and just creating a new object that is called owners with the same content. So this is going to contain, the set is going to contain a unique list of the owner IDs across flows, data sources, and workbooks so that we can tie those back to a user to determine, hey, for each user, do they own content? All right. So let's just look at owners. What does owners have? Actually, only one user on my server owns content, right? So I have one user that owns content, and that makes sense because I have two users, right? So if we go back to my users listing, one of the users is a site administrator creator. The other is a viewer. A viewer cannot own flows, workbooks, or data sources. So it completely makes sense. With your server, this is going to be a little bit different, right? It's going to have a lot more data, right? We're going to have more than one owner ID because you're most likely going to have more than one user that can actually own content versus this cloud server that I own that has two users and they're both tied to me for demonstrative purposes. Okay, so we have that set. We have that set that's going to allow us to tie content back to users to determine whether each user is a content owner. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to document this real quick. It's just one of my pet peeves. So I'm going to say get unique ID values across each list and consolidate those values into one list. And because I'm very OCD, I'm going to capitalize this. And there we have it. So we have that. Now, the next step is we have a set that contains the consolidated values of consolidated owner ID values. And we also have a user info data frame. These two things are separate, right? They're no way tied yet together in a meaningful way. They completely exist separately. So what we want to do is let's augment our user data frame, our user info data frame. And I'm just going to say, just document this beforehand, create a user report based on the user info data frame. what we're going to do is we're going to say users report equals, and I'm going to reference my data frame. Let's say dot assign, and I'm going to create a column called isOwner. I think I tabbed one too many times. IsOwner equals user info, user ID, dot isIn. So is it in the, and I'll explain this here in just a moment actually. So let me just type this out. Close this. It's already closed. Let me go down here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this columns equals isOwner. And we'll call that content owner. Okay. And then I'm going to sort this. Sort values. Let's say by equals content owner. And then ascending equals false. Okay, so before I run this, let's just explain what this is going to do. It's going to create a report that contains our original user info data frame, so those columns that we previously observed. It's also going to derive a new column, so create a new column that's called isOwner, and that isOwner column is going to be populated based on this condition. Is the ID value in each of the rows within our user info data frame, is it in the owner set? And if this is true, that means they are a content owner, right? If it's false, they're not a content owner. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the results of that, rename that isOwner column to content owner. This is going to be a Boolean column. It should be true or false. And then we're going to sort our users report. So again, the augmented user info data frame by the content owner values in ascending. Sorry, non-ascending. So it's going to say we're going to have the people in the report that own content at the top, followed by non-content owners. In that case, that means that my site administrator creator account should be listed first, and it should have a content owner value of true, and the viewer should be false, and also in the second row, because we only have two users in this case. Let's go ahead and run this. And then what I'll do is let's just put another block here, and let's take a look at this. Okay, so we have a user's report, the original user's data frame. So the user info data frame consisted of the user ID, username, display name, email address, and domain, and also the site role. The additional column that we derived here was going to be the isOwner, and we renamed that as content owner, and that's going to contain the results of evaluating whether or not the user ID here was in the list of owners, the set technically, so true or false. All right, so we have our users report. Now the last step here, right, this is not incredibly helpful if this just sits inside an editor. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually write this out to a Excel file. For this portion of the tutorial, I'm simply going to copy and paste code that I've prepared in advance to write our users report to an Excel workbook on my machine. All right, so to write the users report data frame to a specified file path, I'm going to create a pathlib object that specifies where I want to write to and the name of the file. So here is where I'm going to write to. So I'm going to write to a folder called tutorial4. And the name of the file is users_report_, followed by the date and time for which the file was generated. Now this is incredibly useful because most likely you're going to generate more than one user's report. You don't want to overwrite the file, and you also want to be able to distinguish one user's report from another. So let's go ahead and append the date and time for which it was generated. This next part here is going to use pandas to write the user's report to an Excel file at this location. That Excel file is going to have a sheet name called users, and the data of our users report is going to be populated within it. I'm setting index is equal to false because I do not want the redundant row numbering that pandas is going to by default write. I can simply make use of Excel's built-in row numbering. With that, let's go ahead and run this code and switch over to Excel to review our users report. And here's our users report we generated, containing one row per user and the corresponding attributes of our users report data frame: the user ID, the name, display name, email address, user domain, site role, and whether the user owns content or not. That wraps up this video on generating a user's report. I hope you found this tutorial useful. It can use the concepts I covered to level up your ability to manage your own Tableau server. If you enjoyed this video, then please like the video and subscribe to my channel for notifications on future videos. Thank you again, and see you next time.